The collapse of the Eastern and Western fronts. As 1944 gave way to 1945, Germany's once formidable military machine had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The collapse of both the Eastern and Western fronts symbolized the crumbling of the Third Reich's ability to defend its territory on two fronts simultaneously, a fatal flaw in its strategic planning. In the East, the Soviet Red Army, which had been relentlessly pushing westward since its successful defense of Stalingrad in 1943, was advancing rapidly toward the heart of Germany. Soviet forces had already liberated vast territories in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus by the beginning of 1945. The German army, facing massive casualties and suffering from inadequate supplies and equipment, could no longer put up a meaningful defense. The Soviets employed overwhelming numbers and devastating firepower, advancing toward Berlin in an unrelenting assault that spelled doom for the German war effort. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies were making significant gains following the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, in Normandy. After months of intense fighting, the Allies had pushed through France and Belgium, liberating these countries from Nazi occupation. By early 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine River into Germany, and their forces were rapidly closing in on major German cities. The German military was forced into a defensive retreat as the Allies gained more ground each day, with little hope of mounting an effective counterattack. The simultaneous pressure from both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies left Germany with no clear path to victory. German soldiers were exhausted, ill-equipped, and often demoralized by the prospect of defeat. The Wehrmacht German military was no longer the highly trained and disciplined force it had once been at the start of the war. Instead, it was a patchwork of battle-weary veterans, young boys drafted into service, and older men who were too old to fight but had been forced into military service in a desperate attempt to bolster the defenses. The Allies, meanwhile, had achieved air superiority, and their strategic bombing campaigns decimated German cities, factories, and transportation networks. This left Germany unable to adequately supply its front lines with the necessary resources, exacerbating the problems faced by its already stretched military forces. The infrastructure necessary to support Germany's war effort had been systematically destroyed, and the country was on the brink of economic collapse. The Allies' control over both fronts in the final months of the war became an insurmountable challenge for the Nazis. As the Red Army closed in from the east and the Allies pressed from the west, German forces found themselves trapped in a vice. This encirclement, combined with the failure to break the Allied lines, sealed the fate of Germany's military and strategic position. The collapse of both the Eastern and Western fronts not only symbolized the end of Germany's military strength, but also underscored the utter hopelessness of any further resistance. The German leadership, including Hitler, could not halt the unraveling process, and by the time the Allies reached Berlin, the Third Reich had essentially collapsed. The Battle of Berlin. The Battle of Berlin, which took place from April 16 to May 2, 1945, was the final major conflict of World War II in Europe. It was not only a decisive military engagement between the Nazi forces and the Soviet Red Army, but also a symbolic event that marked the collapse of Adolf Hitler's regime and the end of the Third Reich. Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, was the heart of the regime and its ultimate fortress. By the time the battle began, Germany's defeat was a foregone conclusion, but the Nazis, led by Hitler, chose to make their final stand in Berlin, determined to fight to the bitter end. As Soviet forces approached the city, the German military was already in a state of disarray. The Wehrmacht was struggling to hold off the advancing Red Army, whose numbers were overwhelming. The Soviets brought in nearly 2.5 million soldiers, supported by 6,250 tanks, 7,500 artillery pieces, and 2,700 aircraft. In contrast, the German defenders consisted of a mix of exhausted, battle-worn soldiers, elderly men from the Volkssturm, a national militia made up of civilians, and a handful of elite SS divisions. These defenders were in no position to effectively resist the Soviet onslaught. Additionally, much of the German military leadership had already fled or been killed, leaving Berlin's defenses poorly coordinated. The Soviet strategy for capturing Berlin involved encircling the city and launching simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The Red Army advanced from the east, having already crossed the Oder River, and was determined to crush the Nazi regime. The battle began with heavy artillery bombardments and airstrikes that reduced large sections of the city to rubble. Soviet troops then launched a ground assault, pushing through German defenses, which were weak and disorganized. As the Soviets made their way closer to the center of the city, they encountered fierce resistance from Nazi troops, but the defenders' morale was low, and they were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer size and strength of the Soviet forces. For Hitler and his inner circle, Berlin was more than just a military objective. It was the last symbol of the Nazi regime's power. Hitler remained in his underground Führer bunker throughout the battle, refusing to leave the city despite the growing realization that defeat was imminent. During these final days, he issued a series of orders for counterattacks and reinforcements that were unrealistic and irrelevant as the battle raged on around him. The city was in chaos, and the collapse of order was evident. But Hitler's refusal to accept reality and his obsession with holding Berlin until the end were tragically evident. He continued to believe that some miracle would turn the tide in his favor, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, Berlin's civilian population, trapped in the city, suffered immensely. As the battle raged on, German civilians faced constant air raids, artillery bombardments, and the destruction of their homes. Many tried to escape the fighting, but the streets were filled with rubble, making it nearly impossible to flee. People took refuge in bunkers and shelters, but these were often insufficient to protect them from the relentless bombardment. Starvation and disease began to spread as food and medical supplies dwindled, and the city descended into a state of anarchy. Civilians were caught in the crossfire between Soviet soldiers and German defenders, leading to countless casualties and widespread suffering. The Soviet forces showed no mercy during the battle, and the capture of Berlin became not just a military objective, but an ideological one. The Red Army was determined to avenge the suffering inflicted by the Nazis during the invasion of the Soviet Union. As Soviet troops entered the city, there were reports of widespread looting, violence, and mass executions, especially against German soldiers and members of the SS, Soviet soldiers. Many of whom had lost family members in the war, were often ruthless in their treatment of German prisoners and civilians. This brutality would come to define the final days of the war in Berlin and the aftermath of the battle. The German military resistance in Berlin, though fierce in places, was ultimately futile. By April 30th, 1945, Soviet forces had surrounded the city center, and the fall of Berlin was imminent. In the Führer bunker, Hitler chose to end his life, taking his own life alongside his wife, Eva Braun, as Soviet troops closed in on his position. His death marked the official end of the Nazi regime, although the fighting in Berlin continued for a few more days. On May 2nd, 1945, after nearly 3 weeks of brutal fighting, Berlin finally fell to the Soviets, signaling the collapse of the Third Reich and the effective end of World War II in Europe. The Battle of Berlin was not only a military defeat, but also a final, tragic chapter in the story of Nazi Germany's hubristic and catastrophic pursuit of world domination. Adolf Hitler's final days. In the final days of World War II, as Soviet forces encircled Berlin and Allied forces advanced from the west, Adolf Hitler, the architect of the war and the leader of Nazi Germany, retreated into his underground Führer bunker in the heart of Berlin. By this time, the writing was on the wall. Germany had lost the war. However, Hitler's refusal to acknowledge the reality of his situation became one of the defining features of his final days. He remained obstinately convinced that victory was still possible, even as his empire crumbled around him. Hitler's personal and mental decline during this period was profound. He had long been a dictator consumed by paranoia, delusion, and an overwhelming desire for absolute control. But in the last days of the war, his irrationality reached extreme levels. Despite the fact that the Soviet Red Army was storming the streets of Berlin and the Allies were closing in on Germany from the west, Hitler continued to issue orders to his generals for counteroffensives that had no chance of success. These orders were not based on any realistic military strategy, but instead on his obsession with the idea of holding Berlin at all costs. The Führer bunker, located beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, became Hitler's final refuge as the city fell apart. The bunker was a labyrinth of rooms and tunnels, designed to protect its occupants from airstrikes and ground assaults. By April 1945, it had become the center of a dwindling and diluted Nazi leadership. In the bunker, Hitler was surrounded by his closest advisors and staff, many of whom had long since lost faith in him, but were too fearful or loyal to leave. Among them were figures like Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, and Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. However, even in the final days of the war, Hitler remained defiant, refusing to consider the possibility of surrender. As the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler began to show signs of increasing paranoia and instability. He believed that he could somehow negotiate a peace with the Western Allies, despite the overwhelming evidence that they were determined to defeat Germany and bring about its unconditional surrender. He repeatedly rejected any idea of compromise and refused to leave Berlin, even as his advisors urged him to escape and regroup in the south of Germany. To him, leaving the city would be a betrayal of his ideals and a sign of weakness. As the situation became increasingly dire, Hitler retreated further into his own delusions, refusing to face the reality of his failure. In the final days, Hitler's relationship with those around him became increasingly strained. His once loyal generals and officers were growing desperate and increasingly resentful of his refusal to accept the inevitable. As the Soviet troops advanced toward the center of Berlin, Hitler's mental state deteriorated rapidly. His decision-making became erratic, and he was unable to communicate effectively with those around him. His physical health was also in decline. He had been suffering from various ailments, including tremors, which were exacerbated by stress, and he was heavily reliant on a range of medications. His health issues and erratic behavior alienated even those who had once been his most loyal followers. By April 30th, 1945, with the Soviet forces closing in on the Reichstag and the Führer bunker, Hitler made the fateful decision to end his life. As the sounds of artillery grew louder above the bunker, Hitler and his longtime companion, Eva Braun, decided to commit suicide together. Hitler ingested cyanide and shot himself, while Eva Braun took cyanide. Their deaths marked the final end of the Nazi leadership and sealed Germany's fate in the war. As news of Hitler's death spread, Nazi Germany was left without its ideological and military leader. Hitler's suicide was not a final moment of clarity, but rather the culmination of his delusions, his refusal to accept the reality of the war, and his desire to die on his own terms. His death came just days before Germany's official surrender on May 7, 1945. The news of his passing was met with mixed reactions from his inner circle and from the broader German population. For many, his death marked the end of a dark chapter in history. But for others, particularly the hardline Nazis, it was a moment of profound despair, as they had no idea what would come next for Germany. In the aftermath of Hitler's death, the Nazi regime rapidly disintegrated. His closest allies, including Joseph Goebbels, tried to continue the fight, but they too were overwhelmed by the advancing Soviet and Allied forces. On May 1, 1945, Joseph Goebbels and his wife, Magda, also committed suicide in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, after poisoning their 6 children. Hitler's legacy of destruction and madness left an indelible mark on the German psyche, and his death symbolized the collapse of a regime built on tyranny, propaganda, and violent conquest. The final days of Adolf Hitler were a tragic and fitting end to a man whose ambition had led to the deaths of millions and the destruction of an entire nation. The fate of Nazi leadership. As the final days of World War II unfolded and Germany's defeat became inevitable, the fate of Nazi leadership was marked by chaos, betrayal, and a desperate scramble for survival. The downfall of Hitler, coupled with the rapid collapse of the Nazi regime, left his closest allies in a state of confusion, fear, and in some cases a complete loss of purpose. Many of the top leaders of the Nazi Party had either perished in the conflict, gone into hiding, or were captured by the Allies. For those who remained in Germany during the final days, the options were limited to fleeing, surrendering, or facing trial and execution for their war crimes. As Adolf Hitler's closest confidants, including Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and Martin Bormann, found themselves trapped in Berlin as Soviet forces advanced, their fates were sealed by their loyalty to the Führer and their unwavering commitment to the Nazi cause. These men, who had been key architects of Nazi ideology, propaganda, and terror, were left without the stability that the Nazi regime had once provided them. Their desperate actions during the final days of the war were driven by their refusal to accept defeat and by their desire to avoid the consequences of Germany's impending collapse. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, was one of Hitler's most loyal allies, and he believed until the very end that the war could still be won, even as the Red Army closed in on Berlin. As Hitler's right-hand man in matters of ideology and public image, Goebbels had played a central role in crafting the Führer's propaganda machine, which had sought to keep the German population in the dark about the true state of the war. In the last days, Goebbels continued to disseminate propaganda, attempting to convince the people of Berlin that the Soviet forces were far weaker than they were and that resistance would somehow lead to a miraculous turnaround. However, even Goebbels could not ignore the reality of the situation for long. As the end of the war loomed, Goebbels made the tragic decision to follow Hitler's example. On May 1, 1945, with the Soviet forces closing in on Berlin and the city on the brink of collapse, Goebbels and his wife, Magda, chose to end their lives. The couple poisoned their 6 children before committing suicide themselves in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Goebbels' death symbolized the end of the Nazi propaganda machine, which had been so central to maintaining the regime's grip on power for years. His passing also marked the end of one of the most fanatical and unwaveringly loyal figures in the Nazi leadership. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany, had a different fate. Himmler had been a crucial architect of the Holocaust and had overseen the mass extermination of millions of Jews, Romani people, and other marginalized groups. As the war turned against Germany, Himmler attempted to distance himself from the crumbling Nazi regime, hoping to secure a favorable position for himself after the war. In the final days, Himmler attempted to open secret negotiations with the Allies, hoping for a deal that would allow him to escape punishment for his role in the atrocities of the Third Reich. He secretly contacted Swedish diplomats in a bid to negotiate a surrender and negotiate terms of surrender with the Allies. However, Himmler's attempt at betrayal was met with swift rejection. On May 21, 1945, he was captured by British forces while attempting to flee under a false identity. Himmler was placed in custody but managed to commit suicide by ingesting cyanide while in British custody, ending his life before he could stand trial for his crimes. His death marked the end of one of the most notorious figures in the Nazi regime and highlighted the sense of desperation and cowardice among many of the leading figures of the Third Reich. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi government, also faced a grim fate. Bormann had been instrumental in helping Hitler consolidate power within the Nazi Party and was deeply involved in the party's bureaucratic machinery. He was fiercely loyal to Hitler and had been in charge of many of the logistical aspects of the Nazi war effort. When the final days of the war arrived, Bormann remained with Hitler in Berlin, attempting to manage the fallout of the impending collapse of the city. On the night of May 1, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, Bormann attempted to escape Berlin with a small group of Nazi officials. However, during their attempt to flee, Bormann disappeared into the chaos of the collapsing city. For years, rumors persisted that Bormann had escaped to South America or other parts of the world, but his true fate was unknown for some time. It was only in 1972, after the discovery of human remains near the Reich Chancellery, that it was confirmed that Bormann had died while attempting to flee. The remains were identified as his through forensic analysis, and it was concluded that he had likely taken his own life during the escape, unable to face the consequences of his actions. Other Nazi leaders who had been part of the inner circle, such as Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, managed to survive the war and avoid immediate execution. Speer had been one of the few high-ranking officials who had publicly expressed some remorse for his actions during the war and was sentenced to 20 years in prison during the Nuremberg Trials. While Speer avoided the death penalty, his legacy was marred by his association with the regime's crimes. Meanwhile, other Nazi figures who were captured or tried to escape the wrath of the Allies faced different fates. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, had flown to Britain in 1941 in a failed attempt to negotiate peace with the British, and by 1945 he was imprisoned in Spandau prison, where he would remain until his mysterious death in 1987. Other figures, such as Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, and Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, were captured and tried at the Nuremberg Trials. Many of the top Nazi officials were either executed or sentenced to lengthy prison terms for their roles in the war and the Holocaust. In the wake of Germany's surrender, the fate of Nazi leadership was marked by a combination of execution, suicide, and capture. While some escaped justice for a time, many of the key figures in the Nazi regime ultimately faced the consequences of their actions. The collapse of the Nazi leadership in the final days of the war left a power vacuum that was filled by the Allied occupation, which began the process of rebuilding a shattered Germany. The collapse of the German civilian morale. In the final months of World War II, as Germany's military position became increasingly hopeless, the civilian population found itself trapped in a nightmare of destruction, fear, and despair. The collapse of the German war effort was not just a military or political event. It had profound effects on the everyday lives of millions of ordinary Germans. As Soviet and Allied forces closed in on Germany from both the east and west, civilians were caught in the crossfire, suffering from both the physical and psychological toll of a war that had been fought on their behalf, but was now lost. One of the most devastating aspects of the final days of the war for the German civilian population was the relentless bombing campaign carried out by the Allies. For years, the Allies had been strategically targeting German cities, military infrastructure, and industrial centers with bombings designed to cripple the Nazi war machine. However, as the war neared its end, these bombings became even more intense and widespread. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin were subjected to massive air raids that left large swathes of the population homeless and destitute. The bombing campaigns had devastating psychological effects on German civilians. People lived in constant fear of air raids, often huddling in shelters and basements for hours, only to emerge to find their homes reduced to rubble. The destruction of their cities also destroyed their sense of safety and stability. Many Germans were faced with the harsh reality that their once prosperous cities were now unrecognizable, their homes destroyed, and their lives upended. The constant bombardment contributed to a growing sense of hopelessness and helplessness among the civilian population. Some Germans were able to flee to the countryside, but others were trapped in the cities, unable to escape the relentless bombing. Alongside the destruction from air raids, German civilians were also dealing with the collapse of the Nazi regime and the fear of retribution from both the advancing Soviet and Western forces. As the Red Army moved westward, many Germans feared the horrors that awaited them under Soviet occupation. The memory of the brutality of the Soviet advance was seared into the minds of civilians who had witnessed the horrors of war on the Eastern Front. Women, in particular, feared the mass rapes committed by Soviet soldiers, who were often ruthless in their treatment of German civilians. In the wake of the Soviet invasion of Eastern Europe, rumors of atrocities spread throughout Germany, and the civilian population, already traumatized by the war, was filled with dread at the prospect of Soviet occupation. At the same time, the Allied forces, advancing from the West, were not seen as liberators by all Germans. While many people in the occupied regions welcomed the end of Nazi rule, there was also a growing sense of guilt, shame, and fear. For years, the Nazi regime had promoted a narrative of German superiority and the idea that the war was being fought for the protection of the German people. As the war came to a close, the realization that Germany had lost the war and that the Nazis had led the country into a disastrous conflict was a devastating blow to civilian morale. Many Germans struggled to come to terms with the guilt of having supported or been complicit in the actions of the Nazi regime, especially as news of the Holocaust and other war crimes began to spread. Food shortages were also a critical issue for German civilians in the final months of the war. As the Allies and Soviets closed in on Germany, transportation routes were destroyed, and the German economy, already stretched thin by years of war, was unable to support its civilian population. Rationing became more severe, and many people were forced to live on meager portions of food. The black market flourished, with civilians resorting to desperate measures to acquire basic necessities. As the war neared its end, starvation became a real threat, particularly in the larger cities. Disease and malnutrition began to take a toll on the civilian population, further eroding their ability to survive the final months of the war. In addition to physical suffering, the collapse of civilian morale was marked by the psychological toll of living in a nation on the brink of collapse. Many Germans experienced a profound sense of disillusionment and confusion as the reality of their situation set in. Throughout the war, the Nazi regime had promised victory, and propaganda had painted a picture of German strength and invincibility. By 1945, that narrative had shattered, and civilians were left to confront the grim reality of their country's defeat. Some tried to remain hopeful, clinging to the hope that a miracle might occur, but many others had given up hope entirely. The emotional and psychological strain on the population was immense, with widespread anxiety, depression, and despair. For many civilians, the collapse of the Nazi regime and the end of the war also marked the end of a sense of purpose and identity. Germany had been at the center of European conflict for much of the past decade, and the war had consumed every aspect of life. The sudden cessation of hostilities left a vacuum in the lives of civilians, many of whom had defined their lives by their participation in the war effort or their support for the Nazi regime. For others, the reality of their country's defeat brought feelings of humiliation and shame. Many Germans struggled to understand how their nation had been brought to the brink of ruin, and the collapse of the civilian morale was an inevitable consequence of the catastrophic failure of the Third Reich. In the aftermath of the war, the civilian population was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered society. The horrors of war, the loss of loved ones, and the destruction of their homes and communities would leave a lasting psychological scar on the German people. The trauma of the final days of the war, compounded by the guilt, shame, and suffering that accompanied defeat, would take generations to heal. For many, the collapse of civilian morale during the final days of the war was a painful but necessary step in coming to terms with the consequences of Nazi rule and the devastating impact of the war on both Germany and the world. The mass surrender of German forces. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviet Red Army closed in from the east, the German military found itself overwhelmed, its soldiers exhausted, demoralized, and scattered. The mass surrender of German forces during the final days of World War II marked a definitive end to the Nazi war machine and the collapse of German resistance. The unconditional surrender of German forces was not a singular event, but a series of chaotic surrenders and retreats that saw hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians give themselves up in an attempt to avoid death, punishment, or capture by the advancing Allied and Soviet forces. The process of mass surrender began in earnest as the German leadership and military commanders recognized that the war was lost. However, the Germans, especially those in the higher echelons of command, struggled to accept the reality of their situation. Hitler's insistence on fighting to the last man had become an increasingly futile and dangerous mantra, but many German soldiers and officers were unwilling to give up the fight until the very last moment. For those caught in the final battles of the war, surrender was often seen as an act of desperation, one driven by fear of death or capture rather than any sense of conviction. One of the first signs of mass surrender occurred in the Western Theater, where the U.S. and British forces had advanced deep into Germany. The liberation of France in 1944 had already dealt a major blow to German forces, and the subsequent Allied invasion of Germany in early 1945 pushed the Wehrmacht further back. As the Allies reached cities such as Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Frankfurt, the remnants of the German military found themselves outmanned, outgunned, and increasingly isolated. The final push of the Western Allies, including the U.S. Army and British forces, was swift, leaving little room for retreat or organized defense. In response to this overwhelming pressure, German soldiers began to surrender in large numbers. Many soldiers had no choice but to capitulate, as they were surrounded or cut off from supply lines. The horrors of the war, combined with the desperation of the situation, made it clear to many that resistance was futile. The Allies, for their part, often encouraged German soldiers to surrender peacefully, though the brutality of the final months of the war meant that those who resisted were often met with swift and harsh reprisals. For some, surrender was a relief, a way to escape the terror of the battlefield and the specter of a potentially violent death. As the German military crumbled in the West, the situation in the East was even more dire. The Red Army had made incredible advances in the final months of the war, pushing through Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. The Soviet forces had a reputation for being unforgiving in their treatment of German soldiers, especially those who were captured during the Battle for Berlin. German forces, already in retreat, began to surrender in large numbers, particularly in the face of the Soviet offensive. Some German soldiers attempted to flee eastward in an effort to escape the Soviet forces, but this often led to even greater danger, as they were caught between the advancing Red Army and the collapsing German lines. The surrender of the German forces was not a simple matter of individual soldiers giving up their weapons. Whole units, particularly in the eastern part of the country, found themselves surrounded and without any hope of escape. The military collapse was so complete that even the most battle-hardened soldiers realized that further resistance was pointless. Some German soldiers who had been part of elite divisions, such as the Waffen-SS, chose to surrender to the Western Allies, hoping to avoid capture by the Soviets, who had a reputation for executing members of the SS or subjecting them to brutal treatment. The last major act of mass surrender took place in the wake of Adolf Hitler's death on April 30th, 1945. With Berlin surrounded by Soviet forces, many German officers and soldiers knew that the war was effectively over. On May 7th, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces at the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander in Reims, France. This surrender was unconditional, meaning that no terms of negotiation were made. The decision to surrender marked the official end of Nazi Germany, though the fighting did not immediately cease in all parts of the country. Even after the formal surrender, German soldiers continued to surrender in scattered groups, and some units fought on for several days or even weeks in isolated pockets. Some German soldiers, particularly in the far eastern parts of Germany, refused to surrender, either out of fear of Soviet retribution or due to a sense of loyalty to the Führer, but these isolated pockets of resistance were small and quickly overwhelmed. The final German forces in the Alps, facing Allied forces advancing from Italy, surrendered in the final days of May 1945. The mass surrender of German forces was not just a military event. It had a profound impact on the civilian population as well. Civilians living in occupied territories often found themselves in the awkward position of being caught between the German military and the advancing Allies or Soviets. Many civilians hoped for a quick and peaceful end to the fighting, but the mass surrender of soldiers often resulted in chaos and lawlessness. In some cases, German civilians were forced to contend with the aftermath of military defeat, as the surrender of soldiers meant the sudden dissolution of military authority, and local governments fell into disarray. The consequences of mass surrender were far-reaching. The Allies and Soviets took millions of German soldiers and civilians into captivity. Some soldiers were sent to labor camps, while others were held as prisoners of war for years after the war ended. In addition to the military surrender, German civilians were forced to deal with the humiliation and trauma of living in a defeated nation. Many civilians who had supported the Nazi regime in the past now found themselves dealing with the harsh reality of occupation and the consequences of their involvement in the war. The fall of Nazi Germany and the mass surrender of its forces marked the beginning of a difficult and uncertain future for both the military and civilian populations. The horrors of the Holocaust and the legacy of Nazi atrocities. The final days of World War II not only marked the collapse of Nazi Germany, but also brought the horrific reality of the Holocaust to the forefront of global consciousness. As German forces retreated in the face of advancing Allied and Soviet armies, the remnants of the Nazi regime scrambled to cover up the crimes committed during the war, particularly the systematic genocide of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other marginalized groups. The Holocaust, which had been carried out with chilling efficiency by the Nazis for over 4 years, left deep scars on humanity and would be remembered as one of the most horrifying atrocities in human history. As the Allies and Soviet forces closed in on Germany, they began liberating the concentration and extermination camps where millions of innocent people had been systematically murdered. The world had long known of Nazi atrocities, but the full scale of the genocide only became apparent as the liberation of these camps unfolded. Cities such as Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were liberated by Allied forces, and what they discovered was beyond comprehension. The survivors of these camps had been subjected to unspeakable horrors, including forced labor, starvation, medical experimentation, and mass executions. The Soviet army, which was the first to liberate many of the death camps in Eastern Europe, was shocked and horrified by the scenes they encountered. In Auschwitz alone, approximately 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, were murdered in gas chambers, shot, or worked to death in appalling conditions. The Soviet soldiers, upon discovering the camp, found piles of emaciated bodies, mass graves, and the skeletal remains of the victims. The Nazis had attempted to cover up the camps and erase evidence of their crimes, but they could not prevent the truth from emerging. As Soviet forces advanced, they also uncovered the concentration camps in places like Majdanek, where thousands of victims had perished in gas chambers and through brutal forced labor. Meanwhile, the U.S. and British forces liberated the camps in Western Europe, including Dachau and Buchenwald. Dachau, located near Munich, was the first concentration camp to be liberated by American forces on April 29, 1945. The U.S. soldiers who entered the camp were met with the horrifying sight of emaciated survivors and piles of corpses, many of which had been hastily disposed of by the Nazis in a desperate attempt to cover their tracks. The liberators were left traumatized by the conditions they witnessed. Similar scenes unfolded in Buchenwald, where thousands of prisoners had been subjected to medical experiments, starvation, and executions. The Allied forces were faced not only with the task of liberating survivors, but also with the challenge of documenting the scale of the atrocities that had been committed. The discovery of the concentration camps brought the full extent of the Holocaust into sharp focus, and the revelation stunned the world. The horror of what had happened became undeniable, and there was a growing recognition of the need for justice and accountability. However, the survivors of the Holocaust faced a long and difficult road to recovery. Those who were liberated from the camps were often in desperate physical and mental condition. Many had lost family members, and some had lost entire communities to the Nazis' genocidal policies. Survivors faced not only the physical scars of their suffering, but also the psychological trauma of having lived through such horrific experiences. While the Holocaust had been carried out under the direct orders of the Nazi leadership, including figures like Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Adolf Eichmann, it was not only the leadership that was responsible for the genocide. Countless individuals at all levels of society, from camp guards to doctors and bureaucrats, were complicit in the atrocities. Some of these individuals would later be tried at the Nuremberg Trials, a series of military tribunals held after the war to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg Trials, which began in November 1945, represented an important moment in the pursuit of justice for the victims of the Holocaust and other war crimes committed by the Nazis. The trials were a groundbreaking moment in international law, as they set precedents for the prosecution of crimes against humanity and the principles of accountability for state-sponsored atrocities. One of the most infamous figures brought to trial was Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for organizing the logistics of the deportations to the extermination camps. Eichmann was captured in 1960 after living in hiding for over a decade and was eventually brought to Israel to stand trial. His trial brought global attention to the Holocaust and the responsibility of individuals in perpetrating such crimes. Eichmann's defense, that he was simply following orders, became a key element in the debate about individual responsibility for atrocities. His eventual execution in 1962 was a symbol of the world's determination to hold perpetrators accountable for the Holocaust. The revelations of the Holocaust and the war crimes committed by the Nazis were not just a story of the past. They had a lasting impact on post-war Germany and the world. For many Germans, the full extent of the genocide was initially concealed by the regime, and the Nazi government went to great lengths to deny or downplay the crimes. However, as the war ended and the true scale of the atrocities became known, many Germans had to confront the reality of what had been done in their name. Some tried to distance themselves from the horrors of the past, claiming ignorance or complicity by omission, while others acknowledged their role in supporting the Nazi regime. The process of denazification, carried out by the Allies after the war, sought to root out former Nazis from positions of power and influence in post-war Germany. Yet, for many years, there was a reluctance to fully confront the depth of the nation's involvement in the Holocaust. The Holocaust left an indelible mark on global consciousness and spurred the establishment of numerous institutions and initiatives aimed at ensuring such atrocities would never happen again. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was a direct response to the atrocities committed during the war, and it laid the groundwork for international human rights law. Additionally, the Nuremberg Trials became a model for future trials of war criminals, and they contributed to the development of the concept of crimes against humanity in international law. The lessons of the Holocaust were also enshrined in education, with museums, memorials, and institutions established worldwide to ensure that future generations would never forget the horrors of the Holocaust and the consequences of unchecked hatred and authoritarianism. In the aftermath of the war, the survivors of the Holocaust and their families carried the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. The psychological scars were profound, and the impact of the Holocaust extended beyond the survivors themselves, affecting subsequent generations. For many, the trauma became intergenerational, with children and grandchildren of survivors grappling with the legacy of pain, loss, and guilt. The survivors' stories became vital for understanding the human cost of the Holocaust, and many survivors dedicated their lives to sharing their experiences in the hope of preventing future genocides and promoting human rights. The legacy of the Holocaust is one of immense suffering, but it is also a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring need to confront the darkest chapters of history. The world, having witnessed the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis, was forever changed, and the atrocities of the Holocaust remain a powerful reminder of the dangers of hatred, totalitarianism, and unchecked power. The destruction of Berlin and the battle for the heart of the Reich. The final days of World War II in Germany saw Berlin, the capital and symbolic heart of the Nazi regime, become the focal point of one of the most brutal and decisive battles in history. As the war neared its conclusion, Berlin was heavily fortified by the German military, but the city's destruction was inevitable. The Battle for Berlin, fought from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945, was a fierce and devastating confrontation between the Soviet Red Army and the remaining Nazi defenders, and it marked the fall of the city and the end of Nazi rule in Germany. By the time the battle began, Berlin's fate had already been sealed. Adolf Hitler had remained in the city, determined to fight to the bitter end, despite the dire circumstances surrounding the Third Reich. Hitler's refusal to surrender or leave the capital meant that the last remaining pockets of the German military, composed mostly of young, inexperienced soldiers, as well as a desperate civilian militia, were forced to defend the city against the overwhelming might of the Soviet army. On the other side, the Red Army, having already inflicted heavy losses on the German military in battles across Eastern Europe, was eager to finish the war and capture Berlin as a symbolic blow to the Nazis. The scale of the battle for Berlin was immense. It was not just a military clash between two armies. It was a citywide siege in which every building, street, and alleyway became a battleground. Berlin was subjected to relentless artillery bombardments and air raids by the Soviet forces, which wreaked havoc on the city's infrastructure and civilian population. Large parts of the city were reduced to rubble as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly toward the center. As Soviet troops encircled the city, they cut off escape routes, leaving the German defenders with no option but to fight or surrender. The German defenders put up stiff resistance, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Wehrmacht had already been weakened by years of war, and the elite divisions that once fought for the survival of the Nazi regime had largely been destroyed or dispersed in earlier battles. What remained were hastily assembled units composed of older men, boys from the Hitler Youth, and civilians conscripted into service. The famous Volkssturm, or People's Militia, was meant to mobilize every able-bodied German male, but most of the men involved had little to no military training and lacked proper equipment. They fought with whatever weapons they could find, rifles, machine guns, and even Molotov cocktails, but they were no match for the battle-hardened Soviet soldiers. The brutal urban warfare that took place in Berlin was marked by close-quarters combat and the destruction of entire neighborhoods. Soviet soldiers fought their way through the city house by house, street by street, facing fierce resistance from German soldiers and civilians. The Nazi defenders were determined to hold on to every inch of ground, knowing that their fate was sealed if they were to lose the city. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, were fueled by the desire for vengeance for the atrocities committed by the Nazis during the war, particularly on the Eastern Front. The psychological impact of the battle was immense, as the Soviet soldiers had witnessed the horrors of Nazi occupation in Eastern Europe, including the mass executions and genocidal policies of the Nazis. For many Soviet soldiers, taking Berlin was not just a military objective, it was an act of retribution for the suffering they and their people had endured. The final days of the battle saw the Soviet forces close in on the Reichstag, the German parliament building, which had become a symbol of Nazi power. The assault on the Reichstag became one of the most iconic moments of the battle, as Soviet soldiers fought their way to the building amidst heavy resistance. The Reichstag had already been partially destroyed in air raids, and the structure itself had been turned into a stronghold by the German defenders. But as the Soviets surrounded the building and launched a final, decisive attack, it was clear that the Nazi regime was on the brink of collapse. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet soldiers planted their flag on the Reichstag, marking the symbolic fall of Berlin and the collapse of Nazi Germany. Amidst the fighting, Hitler remained in his underground bunker, a short distance from the Reichstag, where he continued to issue orders, even as his world crumbled around him. With Berlin surrounded and the end of the war imminent, Hitler chose to end his life rather than face capture by the Soviets or the advancing Allies. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide, along with his wife, Eva Braun, in the Führer bunker, an event that symbolized the total collapse of the Nazi regime. His death sent shockwaves through the German leadership, but it was ultimately too late to save the country from its inevitable defeat. As the Soviet forces entered the center of Berlin, they found a city in ruins. The once great capital of the Nazi regime had been reduced to rubble, its buildings shattered, its streets lined with the dead. The destruction of Berlin was a symbol of the devastating toll that the war had taken on Germany. The civilian population, already suffering from years of bombing, rationing, and displacement, found themselves trapped in a city under siege. Many sought shelter in bunkers, cellars, or subway tunnels, trying to avoid the constant bombardment and the fighting in the streets. The devastation of Berlin was a grim reflection of the fate that had befallen the entire nation, once powerful and proud, now broken and defeated. The battle for Berlin also marked a turning point in the war. It was the last major battle in Europe and the final blow to the Nazi regime. After the fall of Berlin, German forces continued to surrender to the Allies and Soviets, but the city's destruction was the symbolic end of the Third Reich. For the Soviet Union, capturing Berlin was a moment of ultimate triumph, as the city was not only the political and military center of Nazi Germany, but also the focal point of Nazi ideology. The Soviet victory was seen as a vindication of the Soviet struggle against fascism and an affirmation of the strength and resolve of the Red Army. For the Germans, the loss of Berlin was a crushing blow, not just militarily, but emotionally. The city had been the symbol of Nazi power and a center of the regime's propaganda. With its fall, the dream of a greater Germany under Nazi rule was extinguished. The Nazi leadership had promised victory in a 1,000-year Reich, but instead, they left behind a shattered city and a destroyed nation. The destruction of Berlin was also a harbinger of the post-war fate of Germany, as the city and the country were divided into occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allies. The division of Berlin would later become a focal point of the Cold War. But for now, it represented the end of Nazi Germany and the beginning of a new era in European history. The battle for Berlin and the city's subsequent destruction were not only a military event, but also a deeply symbolic moment in the story of World War II. They marked the end of one of history's most tyrannical regimes and the beginning of a long process of rebuilding, both physically and morally. Berlin, once the seat of Nazi power, was reduced to rubble, but the destruction of the city also symbolized the destruction of the ideology that had brought it to power. The ruins of Berlin would stand as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked totalitarianism and the horrors of war. The unconditional surrender and the division of Germany. As the devastating final days of World War II in Europe unfolded, the inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany culminated in an unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. This surrender marked the formal end of the war in Europe, but it also set the stage for the division of Germany and the shaping of the post-war European order. The events surrounding Germany's unconditional surrender and the subsequent occupation of the country had profound and lasting effects on the geopolitical landscape, laying the groundwork for the Cold War and influencing the future of Europe for decades to come. The decision to surrender was one of necessity for Germany. By the time the German High Command and the Nazi leadership realized the extent of their defeat, the country was already in ruins. The Soviet Red Army had reached Berlin, and the Western Allies had broken through the German defenses in the West. The Allied forces had made it clear that they would not accept anything less than an unconditional surrender, meaning that Germany had no bargaining power or opportunity for negotiating terms. For Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership, the idea of surrender was anathema, but with Berlin surrounded and no hope of victory, they had no other option. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl, acting on behalf of the German High Command, signed the unconditional surrender document at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, in Reims, France. The document was signed by representatives of the Allied powers, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, as well as France. The surrender meant that all German forces in Europe were to cease fighting, and the Nazis were to lay down their arms without any conditions attached. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Germany would be completely and utterly defeated, and its military and political leadership would be held accountable. The signing of the surrender document did not immediately bring peace. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, when the Allies declared victory in Europe V-Day. This momentous day was met with celebrations and jubilation across the Allied nations, marking the end of a brutal conflict that had claimed tens of millions of lives. For the German people, however, VE Day was a day of reckoning. It marked the official defeat of the regime they had supported or been subjected to, and many were left to face the consequences of the war, both physically and morally. In the aftermath of the surrender, the Allies faced the enormous challenge of dealing with a defeated Germany. The country was in chaos, its infrastructure destroyed, its population demoralized, and its military in tatters. Cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg lay in ruins, and millions of Germans were displaced or left without homes. The devastation of the war had left deep scars on the country, and the process of rebuilding would be long and difficult. Additionally, Germany's role in the atrocities of the Holocaust and the war crimes committed by the Nazi regime could not be ignored, and there was a strong desire to hold accountable those who had led the country into such a cataclysmic conflict. One of the first major decisions made by the Allies in the aftermath of Germany's surrender was to divide the country into occupation zones. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the major Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. Berlin, the capital, was also divided into 4 sectors, despite being located deep within the Soviet zone. This division was meant to ensure that no single power would dominate the country and that the rebuilding process could begin in a controlled manner. The division of Germany was not meant to be a permanent solution, but it set the stage for a complex and often contentious relationship between the occupying powers. The Western Allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, sought to rebuild Germany as a stable, democratic nation, while the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, aimed to create a socialist government in the Eastern Zone. The ideological differences between the Allies and the Soviets quickly became apparent, and the division of Germany would become one of the central issues of the Cold War. In the early stages of the occupation, the Allies implemented a series of policies designed to demilitarize and denazify Germany. The Nuremberg Trials, which began in November 1945, were a key component of this process. The trials were held to prosecute top Nazi officials and military leaders for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. Many high-ranking Nazis, including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer, were tried and convicted, and several were sentenced to death. These trials not only sought to bring justice to the victims of Nazi atrocities, but also to send a message that the leaders of the Nazi regime would be held accountable for their crimes. However, the process of denazification was not without its difficulties. While many top Nazi officials were prosecuted, the Allies faced significant challenges in removing Nazis from all levels of German society. Many former Nazis had integrated themselves into positions of power in post-war Germany, particularly in the bureaucracy, education system, and business sectors. The task of rooting out former Nazis and purging the government was a complex and often controversial process, and many Germans were deeply resistant to being held accountable for their role in the Nazi regime. The division of Germany also had profound social and economic consequences. In the Western zones, the Allies worked to rebuild the German economy, focusing on industry, agriculture, and infrastructure. The United States implemented the Marshall Plan, which provided financial aid to Western European countries, including West Germany, to help with reconstruction. This program was vital in rebuilding the war-torn economies of Western Europe and preventing the spread of communism. West Germany eventually became a democratic republic with a thriving economy and a strong alignment with the Western powers, particularly the United States. In contrast, the Soviet zone in the east became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, a socialist state aligned with the Soviet Union. Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet occupation authorities implemented policies that sought to transform East Germany into a communist state. This included land reforms, the nationalization of industry, and the establishment of a single-party system dominated by the Socialist Unity Party, SED. The GDR also became a key part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and tensions between the eastern and western zones quickly escalated. The division of Germany was most evident in the capital city of Berlin. Although the city was divided into 4 sectors, it became a focal point of Cold War tensions. Berlin, once the center of Nazi power, was now a divided city, symbolizing the split between the Western and Eastern blocs. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, when the Soviet Union attempted to cut off access to West Berlin, marked one of the first major crises of the Cold War. The United States and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, in which they supplied West Berlin with food, fuel, and other essentials by air. This crisis highlighted the deepening division of Germany and the ideological battle between communism and democracy that would define the Cold War. The consequences of the unconditional surrender and the division of Germany were far-reaching. The split between East and West Germany and the larger geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union would define Europe's political landscape for the next 4 decades. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 became the physical manifestation of this divide, and the division would not end until 1990, when Germany was reunified after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The division of Germany, which began as a temporary solution to the devastation of war, had far-reaching implications for the future of Europe and the world. The impact of World War II on German civilians and the post-war reckoning. The conclusion of World War II and the unconditional surrender of Germany marked not only the defeat of the Nazi regime, but also the beginning of a long and painful process for the German civilian population. For many Germans, the war had brought unimaginable suffering, and in the aftermath, the scars of the conflict would remain etched into the collective memory of the nation for generations. The civilian experience during and after the war was shaped by profound displacement, widespread destruction, and a deep psychological reckoning with the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The impact on German civilians was felt in numerous ways, from the physical toll of the war to the moral questions about complicity and collective responsibility. The final stages of World War II saw unprecedented destruction for German civilians. As the Allies advanced into Germany from the west and the Soviets from the east, the conflict reached its climax in the massive air raids carried out by the Allied forces. Cities across Germany were subjected to intensive bombing campaigns, including the firebombing of Dresden, which devastated the city in February 1945. The raids, which aimed to cripple German infrastructure and morale, caused widespread civilian casualties and destroyed much of Germany's urban centers. By the end of the war, cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne lay in ruins, with large portions of the population displaced and left without shelter. As the war ended, millions of Germans found themselves in a state of homelessness. The destruction of cities, combined with the collapse of the German economy, left many civilians without food, water, or basic necessities. The scale of displacement was staggering, as refugees fled the advancing Allied and Soviet forces, often traveling on foot or by whatever means they could find. The disintegration of the Nazi state left a power vacuum, and many Germans were forced to contend with the collapse of their familiar way of life. Entire families were displaced, and the demographic makeup of Germany changed drastically as millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe and moved westward. The sheer scale of migration and resettlement in the aftermath of the war was a traumatic experience for many civilians who had lost everything they had known. Beyond the physical devastation, the German population also faced the moral consequences of the war and the role of the Nazi regime in perpetuating its horrors. The question of collective guilt and responsibility for the atrocities committed during the war weighed heavily on the German people. While not all Germans were active participants in the crimes of the Nazi regime, the reality of living under Hitler's totalitarian state meant that the actions of the Nazis were felt by every German citizen. The extent to which the German population supported, ignored, or was complicit in the crimes of the regime was the subject of intense post-war debate and reflection. The question of whether the German people were collectively guilty of Nazi atrocities was debated in public discourse, but for many, the answer was painfully clear. The war had been waged by a government that had deceived and manipulated its population, and the suffering of millions was the result. In the years following the war, Germans were faced with the daunting task of confronting the legacy of the Nazi regime. The process of denazification, which was implemented by the Allies in the occupation zones, was intended to purge Nazi influence from German society. This included the removal of former Nazis from positions of power, the prosecution of war criminals, and the re-education of the population about the true nature of Nazi ideology. However, the process of denazification was not straightforward. Many Germans, particularly in the early years of occupation, resisted confronting the full extent of the crimes committed by the Nazis. For some, there was a reluctance to acknowledge the role of ordinary people in supporting or enabling the Nazi regime, while for others, there was a sense of collective guilt that was difficult to reconcile. The process of confronting the Nazi past was complicated by the fact that many Germans had been victims of the war as well, facing displacement, starvation, and the loss of family members. This duality of being both a perpetrator and a victim created a deeply complex emotional and psychological environment for the German population. At the same time, many Germans had to come to terms with the moral and ethical questions posed by the Holocaust and other war crimes committed by the Nazis. The mass extermination of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others was a dark chapter in history. And as the full scale of these atrocities was revealed after the war, Germans had to confront the reality of what had been done in their name. For some, This led to a profound sense of guilt, while others tried to distance themselves from the actions of the Nazi regime, claiming ignorance or asserting that they had been forced to comply under duress. The Holocaust had created a deep rift in German society, and the process of reckoning with this past would take decades. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the focus for many Germans was survival and rebuilding their lives. The collapse of the Nazi state left a vacuum, and ordinary people were left to navigate the post-war world with little guidance or support. The occupying forces worked to restore order, but the conditions were chaotic, and civilians had to make do with what little they had. The rebuilding of the German economy was a slow process, but over time, efforts like the American-led Marshall Plan helped to revitalize the country. In the Western zones, West Germany emerged as a democratic republic, and the economic recovery was fueled by rapid industrialization, innovation, and integration into the broader European economic system. However, the division of Germany had profound effects on the German people. The country was split into East and West, and families were often separated by the Iron Curtain. For those living in the Soviet-controlled East, the regime that emerged was one of authoritarian socialism, tightly controlled by the Soviet Union. East Germans were subjected to surveillance, repression, and the denial of basic freedoms. The communist government sought to erase any vestiges of Nazi influence while simultaneously imposing its own form of totalitarianism. This created a sense of division not only between the two German states but also within families, as some individuals chose to flee to the West in search of a better life. In the West, the rebuilding process was marked by a focus on democracy and capitalist economic policies. West Germans sought to put the horrors of the Nazi era behind them and build a new society based on democratic values and human rights. This process was aided by the support of the United States and its allies, who saw West Germany as a bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe. Despite the post-war economic miracle in the West, the moral legacy of the war remained a constant challenge, and many Germans were forced to come to terms with the fact that their nation had been responsible for the deaths of millions during the war. For many, the process of reconciliation was long and difficult, and it took decades before the full extent of Nazi atrocities was acknowledged and confronted. The impact of World War II on German civilians extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the war. The trauma and loss experienced by the population shaped the collective psyche of post-war Germany, and the question of how to reconcile with the past remained a central issue throughout the Cold War period. In the decades following the war, Germany would go through a process of self-examination and reckoning, particularly as new generations came to terms with the legacy of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. The country's post-war history would be marked by efforts to create a more democratic, peaceful, and responsible society, but the burden of history would continue to weigh heavily on the German people for many years to come. For the civilians who survived the war, the journey of rebuilding their lives, reconciling with the past, and facing the moral and psychological consequences of the war was fraught with challenges. It would take time before the nation could truly begin to heal from the ravages of the war, but this healing process would come to define the modern German identity. Despite the hardships, Germany's post-war recovery and commitment to peace have become a testament to the resilience of its people and their determination to never again allow the horrors of the past to repeat themselves.